Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is the 28th, uh, the 28th episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. We spent a long time on Ulysses, and my premise for this course is we don't want to read just Ulysses in the bathtub, but read some books in the bathtub that are actually kind of fun. And everything, the whole premise is that everything we read in this class should be actually enjoyable, and not a chore, as many chapters of Ulysses turned out to be. And before we embark on our next kind of big, serious book, I wanted to spend a couple of weeks just relaxing and sort of reading a few things that don't require as much attention as some of the books we read will require. And I thought that this week, to help myself cool down, I sort of read some Simenons. I've talked about Simenon already, and I decided to talk tonight about one of my guilty pleasures and not so guilty pleasures, which is the old paperback novels of John D. MacDonald. John D. MacDonald is one of the writers that I was shown a way to by writers I knew when I was younger, who, when I was trying to learn how to write, I often tried to read really super serious writers like James Joyce, and then I read lots of like crappy books which I just enjoyed, and I never quite understood the difference between writers who really knew everything about the technique of good prose writing and good fiction writing from the writers who I just had fun reading. And the writers who are always best for us to learn from are the ones who wrote a lot. Many of their books may not be brilliant, but when they wrote a lot and wrote numerous novels, as John D. MacDonald did, I think he published something like 500 short stories and dozens of novels, several novels a year. The good ones, like MacDonald or Donald E. Westlake, one of his contemporaries. Donald E. Westlake, who also wrote on the names of Tucker Coe and Richard Stark. These writers wrote so often and so well that they pretty much exhausted every good narrative technique that a good writer needs to know. So you can just learn so much from picking them up. I really enjoyed the many John D. MacDonald novels, but I was a big fan when I was a kid of the Travis McGee books, and these are the original editions. Most of these are the first paperbacks of that series. They're his Philip Marlowe character. It's a series of sort of detective novels that begins with this: The Deep Blue Goodbye. I'd really recommend these first few books more than any of the other books in this series. Each one of them has a gimmick of a color. Second novel is called Nightmare in Pink. They all have sort of similar pictures on the cover, which is Mr. kind of handsome, sunburned, good-looking guy, and then there's some attractive woman who he usually sleeps with in the course of the book and saves. He doesn't save this one, I'm afraid, but he saves most of these women. And one fearful yellow eye. Again, they all had a color in it, basically so you could tell them apart. Because you can't tell these books apart. They're all exactly the same. So at least you can say, oh, I didn't read the yellow one. I didn't read the chartreuse one. I don't think Scarlet. I don't think I got around to Scarlet. So you can actually tell them apart. Because otherwise there's no difference between any of these books whatsoever. Except the picture of the girl on the cover. They were all published by the great Fawcett Gold Medal ran an incredible paperback series of some amazingly interesting writers. And again, they wrote schlock, but the stuff is almost very often well written, and very often, at the very worst, competently written. And they had a number of important editors there, one of whom was Buckland Moon. His name was Buckland Moon, who was an editor for Richard Stark and Donald E. Westlake at Gold Medal, and for many other writers. I believe he was Kurt Vonnegut's editor. And the thing about Buckland Moon I find interesting is I've interviewed many writers or sat around talking with many writers of that period, and they all knew him as this great editor. And I just looked him up on Wikipedia and some of the online websites, and he's one of the only people of any significance I've ever looked up online. I couldn't find anything useful about him. And there's another editor with the name Buckland Moon, spelled differently than I was told his name was spelled, and there's no knowledge, no indication that he's the guy that edited so many of the Gold Medal books. But there's a footnote in history for some of you aficionados to go find out who Buckland Moon is. He edited a lot of good writers, and all the writers I met who worked with him said he was terrific. So I thought I'd just say a few quick things about these books. One is they're, like many series novels, they're sort of indistinguishable and they're sort of almost omnivorously consumable. You can just pick one up and read it. You don't really need to remember too much in the sequence, as with many good series novels. They came out 2 or 3 a year, I believe. And the premise is that there's a guy named Travis McGee who's not really a detective. He's I think he calls himself a lost property specialist. So he goes out when people have money stolen from them, or property stolen from them, or valuable possessions stolen from them. He's this kind of knight errant who goes out, helps these people recover their money. They're almost always these beautiful women who desperately need sex from Travis McGee at some point in the book. And he helps them recover their money, and he splits the money with them. So if he recovers $1 million from some land fraud scheme, he gives the victim $500,000 and he takes $500,000. This way he can pretty much live his life on a houseboat. It's called the busted flush because he won the houseboat on a busted flush, and that's located somewhere in Fort Lauderdale. He floats around a little bit like that. And there's not much to distinguish the books because they're all so similar. I can often not tell I've read the book before. There's always a woman who needs help, usually at the very beginning of the book. And like many good series thriller novels, I would argue that the first half of almost every one of these books is excellent, really well written, prose-wise. I honestly think that MacDonald was one of the best prose writers of the 20th century. He just wrote lovely, lovely paragraphs. The Travis McGee books are kind of characterized by Travis, who's a kind of cynical, nonconformist who doesn't want to be part of the rat race of the 50s and 60s, who lives on his boat and just wants to enjoy his life and has a very cynical eye on society. And he goes off in these kind of little morality paragraphs in which when he's observing the world around him, which are some of the best passages in John D. MacDonald. And in the course of each novel, the first half of the book is always the best part because it's sort of Travis exploring the world of his victims and the people he's trying to help, and the types of people that they associate with, whether they're bankers or oil barons or property developers in Arizona, as in this book. And he sort of gets to know their world, and he comments on it in this kind of long interior monologue, which are the best parts of the books. About halfway through each book, and this is the one I just reread recently. This one goes longer than the others. About 2/3 of the way through this book, the books turn into very, very conventional thriller chase scenes. So Travis is being chased by some bad guy, and he's trying to save the girl from some bad guy. It goes on for pages and pages, sometimes 30, 40, 50 pages. They're really kind of boring. They're well written. MacDonald never wrote a bad sentence. And yet they're kind of conventional. You just don't care anymore. And the other thing that happens in many of the books, which I find a little tiresome, is, again, many of these women go through some traumatic problem. The character in The Deep Blue Goodbye, for example, there's a kind of evil womanizer whose name I can't remember, who goes around kind of latching on to really beautiful middle-aged women and being Mr. Nice Guy, and then eventually drawing them into a kind of sordid, sadistic world of his own in which he uses them in every possible way and then takes all their money. In almost all of them, the woman has been abused by some evil man, and Travis comes along as Mr. Good Guy, and he does there's always this kind of sexual healing passage in each one of the books where Travis, the woman's always attractive. He somehow brings her out of her trauma and teaches her to love again, physically love again, and go off and find a better person. Those parts of the books are a little boring, but the first half, at least, of every book will will teach so many things about how to write a paragraph particularly. I wanted to read one little passage that I liked out of this book. One last thing before I read the passage. Kingsley Amis, who was one of the interesting critics of the past 50 years, and much more interesting than his son Martin Amis, at one point said that John D. MacDonald in the 50s was an infinitely better writer than Saul Bellow. And I could not agree more. Saul Bellow, to me, is impenetrably boring. And this is a really lovely prose writer, and it's everything Saul Bellow can't do. So if you have a choice between Saul Bellow and John D. MacDonald, pick one of these up. This is a little passage where he's going through one of these state-funded colleges that are kind of sprouting up all over in the 50s and 60s in America. And he has a few things to say about the kids he sees. And notice how he visualizes all these places. We see all these kids. And then we have this kind of reflective consciousness of Travis looking over this world and making pretty sound judgments about what education really should be. And I'm going to read a fairly long passage that I like. State Western was one of those new institutions they keep slapping up to take care of the increasing flood of kids. It was beyond the sleepy-looking town. Hundreds of cars winked in the mid-morning sun on huge parking lots. The university buildings were giant brown shoe boxes in random pattern over substantial acreage. It was 10 o'clock, and kids were hurrying on their long treks from building to building. Off to the right was the housing complex of dormitories and a big garden apartment layout, which I imagined housed faculty and administrative personnel. A sign at the entrance drive to the campus buildings read, "No student cars." The blind sides of the big buildings held big, bright murals made of ceramic tile in a stodgy treatment of such verities as industry, freedom, peace, etc. The paths crisscrossed the baked earth. There were some tiny areas of green, lovingly nurtured, but it would be years before it all looked like the architect's rendering. The kids hustled to their 10 o'clocks, lithe and young, intent on their obscure purposes. Khakis and jeans, cottons and colors, vague glances, empty as camera lenses, moved across me as I drove slowly by. I was on the other side of the fence of years. It's a great line. They could relate and react to adults with whom they had a forced personal contact. But strangers were as meaningless to them as were the rocks and scrubby trees. They were in the vivid tug and flex of life, and we were faded pictures on the corridor walls, drab, ended, and slightly spooky. I noticed a goodly sprinkling of Latin blood among them, the tawny, cushiony girls and the bullfighter boys. They all seemed to have an urgency about them, that strained, harried, trimester look. It would cram them through sooner and feed them out into the corporations and the tract houses, breeding and hurrying, organized for all the time and money budgets, binary systems, recreation funds, taxi transports, group adjustments, tenure, constructive hobbies. They were being structured to life on the run, and by the time they would become what is now known as senior citizens, they could fit nicely into planned communities where recreation is scheduled on such a tight and competitive basis that they could continue to run, plan, organize until, falling at last into silence, the grief therapist would gather them in, rosy their cheeks, close the box, and lower them to the only rest they had ever known. It is all functional, of course, but it is like what we have done to chickens. Forced growth under optimum conditions, so that in 8 weeks they are ready for the mechanical picker. The most forlorn and comical statements are the ones made by the grateful young who say, Now I can be ready in 2 years and 9 months to go out and earn a living rather than wasting 4 years in college. Education is something which should be apart from the necessities of earning a living, not a tool, therefore. It needs contemplation, fallow periods, the measured and guided study of a history of man's reiteration of the most agonizing question of all, why? Today, the good ones, the ones who want to ask why, find no one around with any interest in answering the question. So they drop out, because theirs is the type of mind which becomes monstrously bored at the trade school concept. And again, I think what he says about education then in the 60s when kids are dropping out because they're not learning what they want to learn. You know, he's a very interesting view of American culture, which hasn't the culture which he criticizes in these books hasn't changed that much, though it's much less prosperous. But I would really recommend some of these books. If they get a little boring 2/3 of the way through, you can sort of skim them a bit and pick up another one another time. But I strongly recommend, as an antidote to those times when we read the difficult books, pick up a John D. MacDonald or any of the thrillers he wrote, one of which was turned into Cape Fear. I forget the title of it now. I think it was The Executioners. But he wrote lots of thrillers, paperback thrillers, and even a few science fiction novels, which aren't too bad. So a guy who never wrote a bad sentence. Okay. Next week, we're going to read an incredibly difficult and funny book called J.R. by William Geddes. It's hilarious. It's a huge pain in the ass to read, and it makes you laugh your head off. Okay. Next week. Bye.